So yes, we're talking a little bit about nutrient neutrality today and the impacts on the water industry, and also thinking about the wider piece around resilience with the water industry and how they can contribute to nutrient pollution, basically, which is a big environmental issue. Is one of the most important issues we're dealing with in some of our natural water environments within England at the moment. Specifically, we're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus here. The impacts of those nutrient levels can disrupt the natural processes in the aquatic environment. We've got many of our most important international water-dependent places are designated, under the habitats regulations. And nutrient neutrality is a new legal requirement within those regulations, which has been set out by Natural England. The idea is being that when a competent authority assesses projects and planning applications, they must consider whether that plan or project will have a significant impact on the habitat site. Natural England has issued some guidance and advice about how you need to carefully consider the nutrient impacts of those plans and projects on those internationally protected sites, and whether mitigation is needed to protect that site from additional nutrient pollution. So development plans can be considered nutrient neutral, where they can demonstrate that they'll cause no overall increase in nutrient pollution affecting the specific habitat sites. We've got a map, if Steve will move me on one, if it's okay. Thank you. So these are the current areas around the country in England which are under current nutrient pressure. There's about 27 of them in England, and some in Wales as well. It impacts on 72 of the local planning authorities, which have borne the impacts of this primarily recently, because it's had an impact on consents around new housing development. And over the next 5 years, the issue will more than double. We're expecting those areas to increase and the number of local planning authorities to be impacted by nutrient neutrality issues to increase as well. Move on to the next slide. So we've been thinking about what types of mitigation is applicable for nutrient neutrality. So DEFRA and Department for Levelling Up and Regeneration, so DLUC, have given Natural England a sort of £30 million fund to establish a nutrient mitigation scheme, which will offer credits to enable developers to enable nutrient developments. The NMS is seeking to provide a nutrient mitigation primarily by taking land out of production and using it for the creation of wetlands and other nutrient removal options. And there's a list there which you can take away and have a look at. These are some of the more commonly suggested nutrient measures which we're seeing being brought forward to try and tackle the issues around the country. So creation and restoration of semi-natural habitats, whether it be woodlands or wetlands, treatment of wetlands, including capturing runoff from agricultural land, wastewater treatment upgrades. We can touch on that in a minute around the requirements set out around the industry under the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment. Retrofitting SUDs, looking into existing developments, replacing ineffective septic tanks, which can be a source of both P and N when it comes to that, and upgrading those to package treatment plants. Providing new wastewater treatment facilities where there's nothing there at the moment, and that's a sort of undertaking which Ofwat is looking for the industry to Ofwat is looking for the industry to consider as well, and connecting those packet treatment plants to mains to bring those back into the sphere of wastewater treatment. So temporary agriculture management measures as well, because it's not just focused solely on the water industry. We're talking about agricultural management to ensuring that runoff of PNN is limited to those European sites, those designated areas. Let's move on a little bit. Thank you.
It's over to me, James.
Thank you.
Lovely. So thank you. So what I wanted to do was add a dimension in here about the role that sort of water companies play and how decisions are made and how that supports sort of nutrient neutrality and improved water quality with a bit of context. So through this sort of nutrient neutrality driver, the government is obligating the upgrade of wastewater treatment works in nutrient neutrality areas. You've seen the map. But actually, how does that fit with the overall increasing need to drive greater resilience in the water industry? So a number of things have been emerging over, I would say, the last few years. Notably, back in June last year, the Environment Agency and Ofwat for the first time published a joint position on how water companies need to consider really flood and coastal and drainage related resilience in the context of their statutory roles and duties. So this has been a legacy issue that's really, I suppose, been kicking around since the Flood and Water Management Act was first enacted or received royal assent. And actually, so it's taken best part of a decade, really, or more than a decade, to actually shape up a sort of a transparent sort of description of those roles. And importantly, waste companies, they have a function to effectually drain, and that's their primary function in this context. That is that statutory role they have. So anything else that we would ask water companies in that context to do would be really in a collaborative form, working with other partners to achieve it. So for the first time, that there is that transparency out there. There's links to these things, so you can go and see them. Also importantly, I think it's worth touching on the fact that government set out some strategic priorities for Ofwat in the last sort of 18 months. And a key part of that is baselining resilience. And therefore, that includes things like how the environment should be protected and enhanced by working really to improve day-to-day environmental performance. So that's both across water quality as well as water provision, which is obviously their primary driver, but also to deliver a more resilient sector. So this is more resilient to climate change, more resilient to other externality factors, more resilient to population growth and development needs. So there's some real challenges there. And I think that currently Ofwat and the water industry are looking at, well, how would they establish that sort of baseline against which they could be measured in the future? So there's some important things to be considered. And also there are quite a number of other tools, and these are things I think it's worth us pulling out. So WINEP, Water Industry National Environment Programme, I'll just bring James back in and just to make a few points on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the WINEP, I'm sure a lot of you are on the call. This is a program which is developed by the water industry and regulated by ourselves to a certain extent. We've moved forward to a more outcome-based WINEP from previous cycles. We're building the WINEP program, working with the water companies for PR24 for the next periodic review of water company prices in December 2024. The collective ambition is that we enable sort of a greater delivery of the environment, greater value for customers and communities through the WINEP actions which are set out within the WINEP program. And the nutrient neutrality is a specific driver within the WINEP, as Steve's talked about there. There's a requirement on the water industry to try to achieve a technical achievable limit at wastewater treatment works which are serving a population of 2,000 population equivalent above in those areas which they're impacting on nutrient neutrality. So we're looking at specific drivers through the WINEP program to try and achieve that sort of nutrient neutral status which we're looking for in those nutrient neutrality affected areas.
Lovely, thank you, James. So drainage and wastewater management plans. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with those. So these are in their first round, they are non-statutory. They've been completed and will be finalised really this summer. And government will then make a decision about how they will be made statutory and what components will actually be within that statutory structure. I mean, really importantly, these are really the key interface between risk management authorities in addressing drainage issues in a water company-wide context. So clearly nutrient neutrality and managing the issues around nutrient neutrality fit really firmly within that framework. They are taking a drainage systems approach, so considering nature-based solutions, their role in managing drainage, and also wider catchment measures in an adaptive planning context. So, how will these systems evolve and change, and how will the provision for that be made? However, I think DWMPs are a cycle. It's a journey. You really get things right first time. I know that the regulators have provided some very constructive feedback back to the water companies to enable them to finalise their plans. But I think in recognising that they are a cycle, there's still a long way to go, and there'll be a lot of no doubt achievements in the future. And again, SUDS, so SUDS is mentioned, in delivering neutrality. That has some way to go as well. We know that the scale of and the funding of SUDS, including adoption, still remains problematic. And you need a lot of SUDS systems in order to make a difference. And we know that the current funding rules mean that it's quite complex to actually bring a network of SUDS measures together to actually make a meaningful difference, such that you can attract FDGIA funding or funding from other public sources. And there's work to be done in that area for sure. And then urban strategies. London, so the Mayor of London will shortly be commencing a surface water strategy. That's being done in collaboration with the RFCC, and I know that will be going out to the marketplace actually for tender fairly soon, so from April onwards. And they are looking to develop a surface water strategy for the whole of London. So, and obviously SUDS and a lot of these issues will need to feature in that kind of thinking. But that will help, I think, support a sort of step change and support some of the policy initiatives that are needed. So moving on then, there's a lot on this slide. I don't intend to go over it all, but I think I wanted to just comment about the price review 24. So this is how water companies present and provide their business plans against Ofwat guidance, such that they're then able to make the investments they need in order to manage the kinds of issues we're talking about. So there are two main elements to their expenditure structure. One is sort of baseline expenditure, which is about how they allocate money to cover the base costs of running their day-to-day businesses. And then there's an element around the enhancement aspects. And there's two key bits within that enhancement. One is resilience. So this is about investment to manage increasing risk or changing risk. And that's really against hazards that are kind of beyond the control of those companies, and also new emerging issues that arise. And then, of course, we have the WINET piece, which James has just touched on. And I would say for the first time, the price reviews provide better clarification and to water companies on exactly how they should be approaching the development of their business plans to get the right investments to deliver the right outcomes. So you can look at those links and you can read some of the information associated with it. We'll leave you to do that yourselves. So I wanted to summarize with a few kind of conclusions and points, and then we can have a bit of a discussion. We're happy to answer some questions. So I think 4 key points here. So neutrality does have a very specific habitat regulations driver, but clearly it sits within a much wider water quality and water industry context. And that context considers actually far wider catchment and adaptive approaches to provide solutions than perhaps you would expect to see from a development-driven, singular kind of drive. And the role of the water industry and the regulators in this space is immensely complex. But there are very clear policy intentions, and I believe a lot of enabling mechanisms to enable delivery of improvements to water quality and meet the neutrality drivers. However, success will need very good close collaboration across the water industry and the risk management authority community, but also firm alignment at a regulatory level. So there we go. So we're happy now to open it up for questions. So Jack, I think you're going to facilitate those. So we're all ears.
Yep. Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks, James, for the talk. Apologies for any technical issues at the beginning. If you experienced them, hopefully coming across loud and clear, and hopefully the rest of the webinar was okay technically as well. So yes, please do put any questions in the question answer facility in Zoom, and we'll endeavour to answer them as soon as we can. So I'll start off with one. So the government's environmental improvement plan 2023 that was recently announced definitely said they'll encourage water companies to be upgrading their wastewater treatment plans and roll out nature-based solutions as well. So do you think water companies will invest in one more than the other? And if so, what do you think that might be?
it's a balance. I mean, there's specific requirements set out within the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which is sort of going through Parliament at the moment. It's not actually become an act yet or statutory instrument, which, as I said, sort of sets out the requirements that companies should go back and look at their wastewater treatment works and try to achieve that sort of TAL requirement for works which are serving a population greater than 2,000 PE. So there's a specific requirement which, when it becomes act, companies will have to act on by 2030 is actually the deadline for that. So there's quite a lot of investment they need to make in a short period of time. Is that investment realistic in that short period of time, balanced with those nature-based solutions? We're very keen to see the industry move towards more grey than greener infrastructure. We've enabled that through the review of the WINIT programme over the last couple of years and setting out a more outcome-focused programme, which hopefully, moving towards grey rather than green will enable that to reduce carbon. In the long term, maybe a cheaper and more sustainable solutions as well. But in the short term, the industry faces some big challenges around the targets they've got to meet. And it's not just, we talked a lot about nutrient neutrality here around P&N removal, but industry as a whole has a large phosphate removal program. Targets they need to achieve around Water Framework Directive and around Environment Act P reduction as well. So yes, it's an unenviable task for them to balance the government direction, the government policy requirements, decide how they need to phase that sort of work over the next 10, 15, 20 so years, and actually how they can move more to a sort of green rather than a grey solutions. There's lots of trialing going on at the moment. There's lots of innovation in the sector, which is great to see. But yes, it's not an easy task, Jack, at all, but they are making progress towards that sort of moving away from reliance on concrete and chemicals to a more sort of nature-based solution options.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, Jack. I think James is right. There is a balance. You cannot have, unfortunately, nature-based solutions everywhere, just like you can't have SUDs, because not everywhere lends itself to the land's capacity space to actually accommodate it. So I think it'll always be a balance and a mix, and that's fair. And to be honest, that's but it doesn't mean that we can't be thinking strategically in an adaptive way to actually make a broader step change if it's possible within catchments. But yeah, a mix is almost certain.
Yeah, no, that sounds very reasonable. Thank you both. So yeah, I've had quite a lot of questions coming in. Thanks everyone for putting those in. So I'll deal with them in chronological order. So the first is an anonymous question. So that says, given that the WINEP list will not be out until late spring or early summer, will it be possible to deliver the cost-benefit analysis around nutrient neutrality that Ofwat would expect?
Are you able to comment on that one, James? It's not an area I can comment on.
Yeah, so the WINIT programme, we're working on assessing the options which the companies presented to us, and the companies will then take that forward into their business plans for the October submission to Ofwat, and that's when the economic regulator Ofwat will get involved and look at the overall cost and the size of the programme. So yes, I mean, it's in the round amongst everything else which is in the mix at the moment, to be honest. I mean, there's the programme, the WINIT programme is looking at storm overflow improvements, requirements around the Environment Act, requirements around water resources, sustainable solutions as well going forward. So yes, it's going to be a challenge for ourselves as regulators. It's going to be a challenge for the water companies to balance that programme and phase it over the next couple of years. And it's also a balance for Ofwat to look at how economically viable a lot of the programme is going forward.
Thank you, James. Another anonymous question here. What's the prospect of Natural England designating more nutrient vulnerable zones in the future?
I can't answer that directly. Maybe we should have pulled in somebody from Natural England. We were talking before the call, actually, that maybe we need a CIWEM look to run a specific session with Natural England colleagues coming forward to answer those sorts of questions. I mean, they're under review. as they are with all sensitive area work. So I'd expect the number of nutrient neutrality sites personally to increase. They have increased from the initial ones that were designated back in 2021 from memory. So yes, I expect that as we understand this more, and there's more pressure as well. I mean, the focus, as we've talked about, has been primarily around housing development in the southeast over the last couple of years, but that will expand as regeneration, levelling up takes hold around several parts of the country. So I'd expect the number of sites to increase personally.
Yep.
Great, thank you. A question here from Mariana Manzanis, if I got your name right. Since leaving the EU and not having to adhere to the Water Framework Directive, have quality standards and goals changed? What's remained the same?
Wow.
The objectives have stayed the same. A lot of our work is set out within our river basin planning work. So the objectives of the plan continue, and they will continue. Yes, we've retitled the directive to regulations, but the standards have not changed at all, and certainly the objectives set out in the plan have not changed at all, and they will continue.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. A question here from KA. How is the funding for these nutrient neutrality initiatives allocated? For example, if a development is coming to an area, is the developer expected to make a certain proportion of contribution towards the cost of that, for example, a wetland, or all of it?
We'd have to take that one away. It's not my expertise. I mean, the requirements for the water industry to upgrade the TAL will ultimately be passed on to customers through the price review and the charges, which all of us pay through our water and sewage bills. But other parts of the sectors, certainly developers, I'm not sure, to be honest. We'd have to take that one away. But good question. Thank you.
Thank you. An anonymous question. Which is better upstream, TAL at wastewater works or local retrofit of SUDs, or SUDs on every new development site?
Wow. One size doesn't fit all, does it, James? I mean, I think, I don't think there is an answer to that. It's going to be site specific. You're going to want a mix, aren't you, of upstream attenuation versus, development specific SUDs. And you probably need a mix of both, in all fairness. And one is not better than the other. You may get greater benefits, using SUDs in certain areas, than using other approaches. But one size doesn't fit all, and I think that's part of the complexity here, isn't it? You have to do that investigation to determine which is the best approach.
Great, thank you. A question here from Dara Cregan. Is there best practice type work in approaching nutrient neutrality from elsewhere in the world that we could or should be following?
Yes, possibly. I mean, we do look quite widely around this. We had an integrated constructive wetlands group which was running, or still continues to run. Actually, it sort of morphed into something else with CABA, with the Rivers Trust, and we were looking at some of the barriers to bringing those integrated constructive wetlands to the fore and to bringing them forward in this country. And we were using certain examples from Ireland, I know that, and we were using examples from elsewhere in Europe and the States. Different regulatory regimes, obviously, different requirements. Steve touched on the fact that, some countries have a lot of space for this. You could argue in the southeast there's very little space for sort of large integrated constructed wetlands and those sorts of scenarios. And also different types of effluent as well, certainly with the water industry. You wouldn't be able to necessarily build a wetland which treats down to a standard for phosphate that's required. Yes, it can help with polishing for certain chemicals, and also, obviously a wetland will provide that increased biodiversity in areas. But yeah, so it's lots of examples around the world. Some of them good, some of them not applicable. But I think that's always the case. There's lots of learning we can do from other places, definitely.
Great, thank you. A question from Colin Roberts. Has anyone undertaken a cost-benefit analysis of upgrades to wastewater treatment works against nature-based solutions in stripping out or removing phosphorus?
Yeah, we did we've done, as I say, we did a little bit of that where we were working with CABA. I mean, the requirement on the water industry around TAL is quite specific as it's set out in the Labour Amendment. It's around making that capacity, creating that capacity at works for development. So there's quite limited options for the sector as a whole within the confines of the works. They can combine that with a constructed wetland downstream of the works to help with some of that final effluent polishing. But certainly within the works, there's quite specifics they need to do to reach that permit limit. So, but yes, we've looked at some of the NBS, some of the cost benefit work through the CABA group previously.
Great, thank you. Question from Lynn Ford. Mandatory for sustainable drainage systems is quite new, and Steve said it's quite problematic. Is that just in the nutrient neutrality context? Please expand.
Yeah, well, not just in the nutrient neutrality context. I think it's problematic in terms of well, its ability to be funded, its long-term adoption, the maintenance of it, and we know that SUDS requires a different approach, I think, to those that are responsible for managing it. So I sit on the Thames RFCC. I'm involved with this new London strategy, and it's clear that politics plays a big role in the delivery and implementation and sort of maintenance of some of these kinds of SUDS systems, which sounds slightly weird, but it does. And so I think the complexities around it, are that it's not fully mainstreamed, and until it is, we will find that we answer the same questions multiple times, and we need to share our learning and experience. So I think that's what I mean by problematic. Even if something is statutory and it's a requirement, doesn't necessarily mean it's easy.
I'd agree totally, and maintenance of SUDS is a very good example. SUDS have always been used historically, in various forms. They've been put in with well-meaning activities, but if they're not maintained, they do become a bit of a liability actually from a sort of pollution risk as well. You could imagine the reed bed system catching sediment from a runoff from a road, for instance, which has got a high oil or carbon content, and actually you end up having a sort of a sink for pollution at that point if it's not maintained and reeds replaced and desilted on a regular basis. So yes, it's that sort of, it's easy to spend that capital money to put it in, but it's that long-term operational cost to maintain it, which sometimes I know that certain systems have fallen foul of those problems in the long term.
Yeah, I agree. Maintenance is always a sticky aspect afterwards, isn't it? Yeah, but nevertheless, an essential aspect of SUDS especially. Thank you. So next question is from Steve Lanzon. The nutrient neutrality map clearly shows how certain water companies are disproportionately affected by those measures and therefore their customers. Is Ofwat prepared to agree this huge increase?
Yeah, I mean, it is a regional disparity, as the map shows, that those areas where they've got sensitive habitat coastal environments, or because it's mostly coastal, I've got to be honest, it'll only be certain areas, but it's also the same with other aspects which we're looking at through the WNIP. Some areas have problems with storm overflows, are the greater in the northwest and the southeast potentially, etc. And likewise, water stressed environments, you could argue that that's a classic north-south divide where you've got more pressure of housing and development in the southeast and water. So that's all factored in, and Ofwat are fully aware of that. And there's the regional disparities which we have to work on across multiple areas within the sort of environmental improvement program which the water industry gets involved with.
And I think actually, the slide with lots of information on it earlier about PR24, that does demonstrate actually that there are ways of approaching Ofwat for the investments that are required in order to meet all these commitments. It's a case of understanding them and putting them across in the right way and recognizing how that affects customer bills, and then testing that on the willingness to pay and so on. So the mechanisms are there. It's about understanding it and presenting it in the right way.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. Presentation is key in these topics. Yeah, thank you. A question from Ian Myers. Are the carbon costs of solutions being adequately considered, measured and addressed, especially with a changing climate?
Hi Ian, nice to hear from you. Good question as always from you. Probably not is the honest answer. We need to do more work around this. We need to adequately understand, whether actually the solutions we're putting in or encouraging the industry to put in, should I say, around greener rather than grey solutions actually enabling that sort of carbon reduction that we want to see, and how do we measure that in the long term. We're developing a sort of evaluation piece around the WINIT programme, which will look over the long term around the changes which are going through around water industry enhancement investment through the WINIT programme, and to see whether actually, we're seeing that sort of carbon reduction. But yeah, it's new, early, lots of work going on. But yes, I think there's always room for improvement about what we're doing, as you say, especially with the climate change.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you. A question from Andrew Hartland. Some estuarine habitats have widespread failure for some hazardous chemicals such as PAHs, PBDEs and PFOS, chemicals that are ubiquitous and associated with urban development. When do you think we'll start to talk about, for example, PAH neutrality?
Wow.
Very topical as to what we've seen this morning in the press around, PFOS, etc. in the environment. I don't know. In a previous life, I used to work in the southeast as an environment program manager, where we did a lot of work with third parties, rivers trusts, catchments, partnerships, that sort of stuff. And our predominant issue there was actually urban runoff. It was runoff from roads, not actually agriculture environment, not necessarily wastewater industry, and the impact that that pH heavy urban runoff was having on rivers in South London, for instance, and causing them to to decline. So I think DEFRA are quite well balanced on the urban and the rural environment is around their policies. But I would imagine that yes, in going forward, we'll refocus on the urban environment as well.
Great, thank you. Another question from Cobius Compion, hope I got your name right. Why only PE greater than 2000, as it's the cumulative impact that needs to be considered at a catchment scale from many smaller villages?
Yeah, so again, it's around proportionality, looking at those works which are serving a greater population. As I said, it's all about creating capacity at the works for growth and for development. 2000 was a level which was set, and it's sort of set out in the bill which is going through Parliament, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. For those of you who like reading that sort of legislative stuff late at night, it does actually say there that the Secretary of State can step in and ask for specific sites lower than 2000 PE to be included, down as far as 250 population equivalent. So there is some flexibility there, but the benchmark was set at 2000 from what I understand.
Great, thank you. I think this is a follow-up question, anonymously asked. Are the speakers therefore of the opinion that implementation of Schedule 3 of the SUDS would make a huge benefit for nutrient neutrality?
Wow. Interesting point. I don't know whether it would. It has the potential to, I guess, and benefit, neutrality. But whether it then enables SUDS to be focused in those areas where neutrality is a major issue, I think, basically will be the litmus test, I think. So, yeah, there would be benefits, but I'm not sure it would be the panacea by any means to addressing the nutrient neutrality issue, in my view.
Yeah, greater adoption of SUDS would definitely help, but it's a combination of impacts which we need to solve as a country to address these the nutrient pollution issues.
Thank you. I've got a question from Faladi and Sube. Hopefully I've got your name right, apologies if not. Does nutrient neutrality include total nitrogen permits, which are capital intensive in wastewater treatment works?
That's a good question. I would have to go check that answer, to be honest. I think it does, but I would have to go and check that, yeah. but it certainly covers P&N when it comes to the sector. Yes, most definitely. I mean, the majority of the works are focusing on P rather than N, although there are some P and N combinations which needed to be looked at by some water companies. But yeah, I'll get a follow-up answer to that. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. A question from Colin Roberts. Has the ticking time bomb of nitrogen release from groundwater sources been considered going into the future?
Yes, groundwater, the forgotten water to a certain extent. So not forgotten, no. You know, nitrogen from agriculture into groundwater is still a big issue. It's one of the main reasons for failure when it comes to some of our groundwater bodies in certain parts of the country. So not at all, not been considered. Not been forgotten, but definitely being considered.
Great, thank you. An anonymous question. Is it appropriate to require treatment works to meet TAL, even if there is no or very little forecast growth in the catchment in the foreseeable future? Nutrient neutrality in LURB seems a blunt regulatory instrument rather than appropriately targeted.
I'm going to probably defer to a written answer on that one, if that's okay, afterwards.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, it's a measure that's been brought forward through the bill, and to look at it, yes. So you could argue, yes, it's blunt, yes, it's not, but actually, you know, we need to unlock some of the issues we've got around stalled growth in certain parts of the country, and this is one of the many tools which we talked about. But I'll formulate a written answer for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A question from Kate Bullen. Has anyone undertaken a whole life environmental evaluation of the impact of chemical dosing for phosphorus removal on sewage treatment works, i.e. the carbon impact of the chemical production and transport and construction versus the benefits of nutrient removal?
Not my area of expertise, but I think that's certainly the sort of stuff that the industry would look at as a whole, as is in their choice of solutions to address this. You know, there's not just chemical removal, there's biological removal of P as well, which they're considering, which is used in some places as well. So I'm sure it has been, but maybe I'll see if I can find some literature on that or about what's been done. But yeah.
Thank you. And our last question, is there any working going on to identify other existing large contributions of nitrogen into these catchments and address those as well as from wastewater treatment works?
Again, I'd have to take that away, get some input from Natural England colleagues, and because we have a sort of a team within the Environment Agency that works on nutrient neutrality and nature recovery. So I can take that away. Thank you.
Yeah, and actually, Jack, I think some of these questions does imply that actually, if we did another session with Natural England, it may actually add some significant value to our community here. So I think it's something we should take away. So rather than James and I perhaps trying to go away and answer all of these questions, which could be quite intensive, that we should work with CIWEM to try and create a situation where we can maybe get those questions answered in another forum.
Yes.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll look into sort of collaborating with Natural England to see if we can get something set up, because I think, as you say, the value of that would be significant. Another question from anonymous. Are the upgrades and nature-based solutions by water companies the long-term aim for nutrient neutrality mitigation, or will developers still need to mitigate after the 2030 updates?
I would imagine they would, personally. I mean, the ask on the water companies is very much something which they can build into their planning in the short term, because they're considering their environmental enhancement programs as the moment, as I said, for the next periodic review of water company prices in 2024, and they'll be building that into their business plans later in the autumn. So it's very much going back and looking at their works, whether they can achieve TAL above 2000 PE for P&N. The N standard as well is under review as well in this country. It's a standard that's been around for a while. The phosphate standard is always working on the P standard, but the N standard. So yeah, I'm sure there's more work to do, but certainly the ask on the industry is to try and achieve that TAL by 2030.
Yeah, great, thank you. And the final question, which which is great. Final question on the list, and it's probably the final question that we've only got time for. So, anonymous question, they warn it could be a different topic. Is there any future plan to look at the containment of copper and zinc prior to discharging water into the watercourse as part of the environmental quality standard? Or maybe that's something that we can again bring Natural England in on. It might be the as well. But Steve, James, anything to add?
I can take that away again. We can have a look at that answer.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Jack.
Wonderful. That's all the questions answered. So Steve, James, thank you again very much for your time. Thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. As mentioned, we'll try and get a recording of the webinar up onto the CIWEM YouTube channel shortly. But again, thanks very much for attending, and have a good rest of the day.